Tonight's story is the story of Heidi.
What's Heidi?
She's a little girl who lived in the Swiss mountains.
Oh.
The first bit is when she meets grandfather. So, her mummy had died and her daddy had died, and her aunt was looking after her. Her aunt is her mother's sister. But her aunt didn't want to look after her, so her aunt decided to take her up the hill into the mountains to be looked after by grandfather. So they took all of Heidi's clothes and went up the mountain to see grandfather. At last, at the very top of the mountain, they met the grandfather. The grandfather wasn't very pleased to see them. "What do you want?" he said gruffly to the aunt and to Heidi. "This is your granddaughter, Heidi. This is your dead son's child. I've brought her to live with you because I don't want to live with her myself." "Take her away," said the grandfather. "I don't want her." "I don't care," said the aunt. "You have to take her. Both her parents are dead. And I'm going to Frankfurt, and she can't come with me." And with that, Heidi's aunt turned and ran down the mountain, leaving Heidi with grandfather. Heidi thought, "My aunt doesn't want me, and my grandfather doesn't want me. Nobody wants me. What shall I do? Where can I go?" "Well," said grandfather gruffly, "you'd better come in." "Ah," he said with a scowl. So Heidi went into grandfather's hut. There didn't really seem to be any room for her to sleep anywhere. "Where shall I sleep?" she asked. Grandfather shrugged. He didn't seem to care. He didn't look at her. "Well, you have to find your own bed," he growled. Up above the top of the shed was what's called a hayloft. That's where you put the hay. So Heidi found a ladder and climbed up into the hayloft. And there she made herself a sort of bed with a blanket and the hay. "I'll sleep up here," she called to grandfather. "Well, at least you've got some sense," he thought. "Better come down now, it's supper time," said grandfather. That's grandfather, and that's Heidi. Then grandfather gave her a large bowl of warm milk. "Here you are," he said. Then he tossed her some bread and cheese. Heidi realized how hungry she was. She ate the cheese and drank the milk. She crunched on the bread, and she finished every last drop of milk and all of the food. Then, as she was at the top of the mountain, she could see the sun setting in the distance, and the mountains started to glow a beautiful red from the sun going down. "I like the view, grandfather," she said. That night, Heidi snuggled down in the hayloft. She wondered why grandfather lived all alone, so high on the mountain. What made him so sad and unfriendly? Early next morning, Heidi woke up, still in the hayloft at the top of the shed at the top of the mountains. She could hear the sound of the bells. What bells were those? They must be cowbells. She sat up, looked out of the window. The sunshine was pouring in, and it was turning the straw in the hayloft into a shimmering gold colour. She got dressed and went down the ladder. Outside the front door was a boy called Peter.
Daddy, it's another story. Daddy.
Do you want to come with me? Said Peter. I'm taking these goats up the mountain to get some fresh grass for them. And Heidi looked, and there were lots of goats. One of them licked her hand. Those are the goats. All right, she said, but I want some breakfast first. So Heidi and the little boy had some breakfast with a bowl of milk and some bread. Then off they went into the mountains together, taking the goats with them. From now on, every day Heidi went out with Peter and the goats. And as she went up the mountains in the sunshine, her cheeks grew rosier and her eyes grew more sparkly. Every day, Grandfather fed her crusty bread, tasty cheese, and little swan's milk. And at night, he would tell her stories by the fire, just like I'm telling you a story now.
Who's that?
Then, one day, her aunt knocked on the front door. Her aunt had come back from Frankfurt. "I've come to get Heidi," she announced. "I should never have left her with you in the first place." "No," cried Heidi. She was suddenly afraid. "I like it here. I want to stay with Grandfather," she said, hugging Grandfather. The aunt ignored her. "I found a place for Heidi in Frankfurt," she told Grandfather. Grandfather was looking crosser and crosser during this speech. Finally, he got so cross he said, "Take her away and don't ever come back." Heidi didn't want to go. She cried and she cried. She wanted to be with Grandfather. She wanted to stay in the mountains. She wanted to go up the mountains every day with the goats and with her friend Peter. But the aunt grabbed her arm and dragged her down the mountain again. As they left, Heidi looked back and saw poor Grandfather sitting all alone, crying, his head in his hands because she was going. "Poor Grandfather," cried Heidi, weeping. The tears were pouring down her face. "Come on, Heidi," said her aunt, pushing her down the mountain. "I should never have left you with that old man." "Why is he so sad?" asked Heidi. And the aunt replies, "First his wife died, then your father, who was his only child, wasted all his money and died too. But your grandfather's just made things worse for himself. Forget him, Heidi. Think about Frankfurt, where I'm going to take you." "I'll never forget him," said Heidi. And so Heidi was taken to Frankfurt, where she had a job in a house.
Hey, what are you doing?
She worked in the house for a long time and earned some money. But finally the time came to go back home to the Swiss mountains. One day, Grandfather was looking out of his window and he could hardly believe his eyes. Somebody was coming up the hill. Who do you think it was? It was Heidi. Heidi threw herself into Grandfather's arms. "Heidi," he cried, "you've come back to me. I thought I'd never see you again." Then Heidi told grandfather something. "I brought a friend. It's Clara, the girl I was looking after in Frankfurt. She's sick." So Heidi and Clara were now in the mountains with grandfather and the goats.
Huh?
Now Clara met goats for the first time. She'd never seen a goat before. And the goat licked her hand. Now the mountain air was very good for Clara, who was the friend of Heidi. And it wasn't long before Clara and Heidi was going up the hill together, Heidi pushing Clara in her pushchair. One day Peter came into the hut while Clara and Heidi were fast asleep. Heidi had a pushchair which she sat in. Peter took the pushchair and threw it down the mountain. It crashed down the mountain and broke into little pieces. Peter then realized what he'd done and fled. When Peter arrived at the hut for the goats later that day, Heidi told Peter that Clara's chair had blown down the mountain and crashed. And then she said, "Grandfather has to carry Clara everywhere." "Yes," said Grandfather, "but I think I knew who caused that wind to blow the pushchair down the hill." Grandfather suspected Peter. Heidi was shocked. "Did you do that, Peter?" she said. Peter went red. His face turned red with embarrassment. I'm so sorry," he said. "I wanted your friend to go so I could have you all for myself." "Don't worry," said Heidi. "We can all be friends." And then Heidi said to Peter, "If only Clara could walk. If only she could walk. It would be so much easier." "Well," said Clara, "I do feel stronger." And then she put her feet on the ground and Grandpa helped her stand up. "My legs feel so weak," said Clara. "Be brave," said Grandfather. Slowly Clara put one foot in front of another, and in no time at all she was walking, only just wobbling a lot. But from then on, every day Clara walked a little more. Hungry from the exercise and fresh mountain air, she wolfed down huge meals. Strength flowed into her, and she tingled with energy. Then Clara's father arrived to see his sick daughter. But Clara wasn't sick anymore, and Clara stood up and ran to her father, who was so astonished to see her walking. "Isn't it wonderful, Daddy?" she said. "I can walk." And then, as the friend Clara went away with her daddy, Heidi stayed with her grandfather and looked at the sunset.
Finish.
And there they are, looking at the sunset as the sun goes down.
It's nearly finished.
Heidi with her grandfather, happy
It's
again.
nearly finished.
It's finished. It is finished. That's the story of Heidi.
But you must have a little bit. They don't have a little bit. Oh, okay.
So, shall we summarize the story of Heidi? She went up the mountains. She found a friend called Clara. Clara's wheelchair broke because Clara couldn't walk. And then she started walking. And then her daddy came. And Clara went away with her daddy. And Heidi could stay with her grandfather, all happy. And everyone was happy afterwards.